embarrassing and from a long time ago, but I won't stop you.
Oh, don't worry. It's got nothing to do with this CV. It's just about how much I love you. Basically.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, no, I'm all ears.
Are we ready, Jane? Okay, well, I wanted to let everybody know that I'm not even going to pretend to impartiality tonight. I'm an unabashed Rick Morton fan, and I was so because of his journalism long before I read his incredible debut, 100 Years of Dirt. Who's read that? Or there's probably about 10 people here, Rick, who've read 100 Years of Dirt. And how many people have read My Year of Living Vulnerably? Couple. I've read it, luckily.
Yeah. So far, you're the one that counts at this point, Meri, although I'd love everyone else to do it as well.
Yeah, it's all about me. Rick has been a journalist since he was almost 18, starting with the Gold Coast Bulletin, followed by a stint at the Australian, and now senior reporter at the Saturday paper. Just recently, I've heard Rick talk about, on the 7am podcast, about the NDIS, the Royal Commission into Aged Care, the complexities of Australian casinos, multiple angles on the coronavirus. And it always seems to me that Rick, basically there isn't a question that he can't answer. I feel with this book, My Year of Living Vulnerably, that Rick has consolidated his hero status as a truly unique figure in the writerly landscape of Australia. And I'm really happy to welcome him being with us tonight. Welcome, Rick Morton.
I am blushing. That is the best introduction I've ever been given. That actually is wonderful.
I'll send you a copy.
Thank you.
You can give it to other interviewers.
I'll give it to my mum.
Sign it. Yeah, that's right. You wrote a book about love, and I wanted to know about how this idea germinated for you, because that is a big thing to take on. And you know, your mum gave you a bit of a ribbing about it as an initial idea. But tell us a little about how it came to you.
Well, I mean, look, I didn't want to overextend myself by tackling the greatest philosophical question known to humankind, but it has been something that even when I wasn't really cognitively aware of love's role in my own life or the lack thereof, it was something that fascinated me. And the poetry, and I think because I had been wounded, you know, my favorite poets like Jane Hirschfield and Maggie Atwood and Mary Oliver, it was all about love. And the lines that stuck with me the most and that hurt the most, in both beautiful and kind of mournful ways, were about this, not just romantic love, but about this sense that you've been left behind by the world, in all of the different ways that manifests. And, you know, I'd been thinking about this before I kind of came across this condition that I had, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but it kind of all clicked into place when I got that, because the very foundation of that as a condition is that it's kind of a twisted or absence of love that makes that happen, and it kind of makes that trauma build in your own body. And so, you know, the moment I realized what that was, all of the previous kind of years of reading for fun and, you know, that kind of sad beauty that you find in wonderful words and sentences all made perfect sense to me. And so I decided that I would do something as big as the question itself, I think. And I don't know what gave me the right, but I wanted to do it. And I thought, why not with the second book? It's like a second album, right? I've got to do something different.
A difficult second album.
Yeah. Not that I'm a musician or at all musically inclined, but that's the metaphor we're going with for the time being.
Since you mentioned having the complex PTSD, I'd love to hear you speak about what it felt like to realise that you had been misdiagnosed, and the time that you'd spent being treated for something you didn't have, you know, must have filled you with a kind of sadness and regret before you could actually move into being treated for what you actually do have.
It was sadness, and it was kind of a sense of lost time, which ironically was something that I already felt about my life, that I had put my life on pause through this kind of, you know, dedication to excising love from my life to try and protect myself. And so I'd already done that to myself. And then I realized that it had been done to me by this misdiagnosis for, you know, the better part of a decade. And it was really frustrating. And I didn't blame any particular individual. You know, and I saw so many different people in the mental health system over 7 years. but it was just the way things were set up, and it felt like I had, you know, lost those years to kind of this dark searching for answers that were just right there. Like they were right there and no one mentioned it. And like, funnily enough, just the other day, I got an email from the psychologist the very first psychologist I ever saw on campus at my university, who had heard me talk about this. And God, she was so wonderful, because she's like, I am so sorry that I diagnosed with anxiety and depression, because on reflection, there was a wounded little boy there that I just didn't see, but also that she didn't have the capacity to see because she wasn't funded to do any of those things. And so my anger has always been directed at systems in my life. You know, I don't think anger is a useful emotion personally, and I'm not built that way, but, you know, systems that perpetrate these things can and should be kind of met with outrage and opprobrium, because they can be changed, and they can make a huge difference when they are. So that's kind of what I was thinking when that happened to me, because it just felt like I had been, you know, set back, that I'd been given a handicap in the race.
I would love to hear you talk about why your dedication in the book is to Lauren. I wrote this for us. Lauren is your sister. Why did you dedicate the book to Lauren, and why is it for you two?
We're very similar, Lauren and I. She's 7 years younger than me. And for the longest time, I had never considered that what had happened to us as a family had also affected her. Obviously it had, but she was only 3 weeks old when, you know, the circumstances of my family, you know, family's unraveling began in 1994. And so she doesn't remember the cattle station. She doesn't remember my brother's burns on Father's Day 1994. She doesn't remember my father having an affair with the governess. But she also spent her whole life until the age of about 24, I think, never having met my father as someone who could remember him. You know, he met her when she was born, and that was it. And, you know, he stopped sending cards to her when she was about 4. And so she grew up with a different kind of absence that was noticeable by its outline of what should have been there, whereas mine was more filled in because I knew my father. But we both had the same kind of emotions. And I never realized exactly how powerful that was for her until she wrote a letter to him in her mid-20s. And I read it, and I thought to myself that she could have written that about me. And so, you know, we've always found it a little bit tougher to address these kind of big picture things in our lives. And so I really wanted to write something that I hoped could speak to her in the same way that I hoped something could speak to me around that same age.
And has the understanding that has been brought about by you writing this book changed the conversations that you and Lauren, and maybe you and Lauren and your mum are having?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my sister was the first person to read this book, and I was really worried about what she was going to think about it, because, you know, she's a midwife in country Queensland, and she's very much like, loves just getting out there and going to the BNS balls and, you know, shooting pigs for fun, which is, you know, an option, I guess. And so I'm like, is she going to care about any of this stuff? And is it going to speak to her? And I don't want to give away too much details, but like, at the end of reading that manuscript, she did something that I never thought she would ever do. And it really just kind of spoke to me quite powerfully. And we found each other even since, being more open with each other and calling each other more often just to talk about life stuff, which we kind of never did. Or if we did, we joked about it as a cover. And so even just in that really concrete way, it's already had an impact. And I think that's really beautiful.
I remember, I mean, you're very active on Twitter, so it was probably 2 days ago and 200 tweets ago, but yeah. You showed some footage of your mum with the cover, running her fingers over the cover of the book, which is just the tenderest, most lovely moment. Was it you who took that video?
No, it was my sister. She was back home from Dalby for a couple of days, because I was in Sydney, and she just was, you know, we've got a habit among us children of filming mum doing funny things, which I'm sure probably stresses mum out. But she just sent me this 3-second video, and mum didn't know it was being taken. And it's just mum just kind of like caressing the cover of this book. And you could just kind of see how proud she was, I guess, in that video, and how kind of tender it was. And it felt like a little insight into her thinking, which, you know, technically I know, but it's always nice to have confirmed by these autonomous things in which you're not trying to say something nice, but you're actually just feeling it.
Yeah. I want to ask you about breaking it down, because I mean, you've laid it out. The chapters are touch, the self, forgiveness, animals, beauty, masculinity, loneliness, kindness, dysfunction, doubt, next, and beginnings. And it made me think about what you started. You started with a homogenous mass of all of the things that had contributed, all of the research that you were going to throw into that mix. How did you sort it so that it could make sense to you as a way of telling and exploring what you needed to explore?
Look, some people would say that I didn't. Like it's the book is very much the way my mind works, which is not I'm not trying to pump my own tires, but it's just I find myself thinking in metaphors and similes and trying to process as much information as I can in every single respect. And every time in mid-conversation with friends, I'm always the guy that has a simile, or be like, oh, it's like that, it's like, a tugboat captain trying to go backwards up the river, or, just silly stuff like that. But, the book itself, I mean, I write in themes very easily because I know that I can keep, a general kind of segment of the information in one chapter, such as in touch, and where I want to say something about the vital power of that human connection, like actual physical touch. And they all kind of lead, I mean, for me, it started off with that because touch was, in my way of thinking, the first real evidence that I had been wounded, and I didn't even know it because my skin automatically became hungry, I guess. And so it was only natural for me to start off with that. And then I was trying to, write about the self because I was going into therapy and trying to, crack the code of my brain, which is almost impossible. And the rest of it kind of, I don't know, it's hard to, I mean, I said this before somewhere else, but I'm like a bowerbird for just like really interesting, curious things. And if you squint at something in the right way, there's always a way to make it fit into what you're thinking about in any given moment. And obviously there's a propensity, I think, if you're thinking about, for example, beauty, to find things more beautiful. In fact, that's kind of the point of that chapter. It's the attention that creates the beauty. And so forcing myself and through that process, the reader to pay attention to these different little artifacts and curiosities throughout the book is, I think, part of that process of sifting, because it's all fascinating to me. And I think it all has such wonderful explanatory power when you're talking about the self and how you kind of come up against the world. And so, I mean, if there's a system behind it, I'm not aware of one. It's just intuition on my part. And I'm sure I get it wrong as often as I get it right. But if something feels right, then I put it down.
I was re-listening today to the forgiveness chapter, and I was really interested to hear you talk about how you learn to forgive, because it's the most enormously hard thing to honestly do. But as you say, you've already said that you don't see anger as a valuable thing to hold on to or a useful way to go forward in life. But do you know how you learn to forgive?
It's a very good question, because I'm not sure that I was taught by any one person. It became an amalgam, I guess, of different approaches. And part of that, I think, comes from the resilience of having lived a tough life in general, and particularly for my mum, obviously, watching her raise 3 kids. There were things about which you just simply did not have the energy to dwell on. And it became very clear to you, I think, in those moments, was certainly for me watching my mum, and then later on having my own struggles. There are things which are necessary in life, and those are things like food and shelter and nourishment and love. And there are things that only get in the way. And so I think once you've lived even a little bit of suffering, I think forgiveness is actually something that can come out the other side. It doesn't always, and it's not something I'm going to ever tell someone individually that they must forgive, because that's a very personal thing. But I think there is an understanding and a kindness that comes naturally to people who have suffered, particularly if they have suffered, not at their own hand. And it's just, in a pure energy equation, it's just something you look at and you're like, forgiveness is only natural, or the only thing we can do, because to do anything else would actually bring us down, and it would be a liability, and it would be, I guess, devastating in the space it takes up in your life. And if you live a threadbare life, then you don't have time for that. And I think it's, pardon me, I don't know where that came from. I think it's also just, the people I grew up with were very salt of the earth. There were no airs and graces. There were no one was trying to impress anyone. And it didn't matter. You weren't, a lot of the slights that we take personally are slights against our ego and character at a really kind of low level of harm. Obviously, there's many more serious things. And if you're not trying to protect anything, then you're more willing to forgive, the errant behavior or the slights of other people, I think. But again, it's one of those things that I say in the book, you can't pluck it out of thin air. You have to tend to the kind of components of it, like kindness and grace, I think, and just having a general attitude of, I think, understanding where people are coming from, and that people of all different walks and creeds and what have you have been wounded and have been harmed and have been hurt. And when you know that, I think you find yourself more willing to be able to forgive.
I wasn't going to move on to the journalism just yet, but I feel like I want to, because you're talking about being, exposed to a lot of different people and observing people in the way that they process things in life. And that's one of the privileges of being a journalist. And it might sound funny to talk about journalism and love, but I think there's something about your journalism, which is it's advocacy. I'm really, I heard you speak about this in another interview where there was a moment that kind of switched you over, and it was the GP co-payment scenario, sort of 2014, 2015, that kind of switched your mind about who you needed to be as a journalist.
I was told, I was taught in the old school newspaper tradition of journalism, which is that you are there to report, he said, she said, report the facts, but also don't put them in context. It's not your job to analyze, which was also just not true at the time, because the most senior reporters who earned a lot of money were always analyzing things in the columns and getting to say whatever they wanted. But it was kind of like this trick to keep the young ones in place, I think, and to make them do the work before they got to that point. And I must admit, I never really, obviously I grew up with politics, but I didn't know it was politics. I grew up, living a life that, spoke to inequality, and it spoke to justice and issues of kind of social good, but I didn't know the names or the labels for any of these things. And so I didn't think that I had anything political to say. And I used to say to people, I'm like, I don't care. I don't know anything about politics. And I didn't. I never joined any party. I'd never even, there wasn't a student union at the university I went to, because it was a private university and I was there on scholarship. So there wasn't even traditional student politics. And so I carried that with me into my journalism. I'm like, I don't know the answers to these things. And so I'm just going to do my job. And after a long time, 3 years at the Gold Coast Bulletin and 2 or 3 years at the Australian, it occurred to me that my life was political, and that my life did illuminate some of the darker corners of kind of public discourse. And not just, my life to a small degree, but my mum in particular, and watching policy debates unfold by people who clearly had no idea what they were talking about. And I mean, even the well-meaning ones, they just didn't know. And even when they were trying to be generous in their assessment, still couldn't grasp why a $7 GP co-payment, for instance, could be the difference between homelessness and having a roof over your head. And that was the moment.
The privileged background of a lot of journalists, that they tend to come from a certain kind of echelon of society to start off with, so they don't have that lived experience.
They just don't. And almost as a rule, and for the ones who did go to public schools, state schools, the ones from a different generation just never talked about it. And because they were also steeped in the same traditions that I was, to a much larger degree. But something happened in that moment, and the shackles just kind of came off a little bit, slowly at first. But I realized then that there was there was a way that you could do harm by sitting on the sideline. And that was a really big moment for me when I finally got that through my head, because even after that GP moment, I tried to be subtle, but I still tried to work within the strictures. And, I was at the Australian for another 4 years after that, 4.5 years. And it was just a real slow drip in terms of realizing that being neutral is just sometimes just as dangerous or just as violent, depending on the urgency of the situation, as taking the wrong side. And so I realized then that I had to do something more effective with knowledge that I knew I had.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you describe yourself as a journalist now, particularly now that you're at the Saturday paper and, you're not required to kind of to neutralize everything by just doing he said, she said anymore. I'm really interested to know how you think of yourself. What kind of journalist do you think you are?
It's a really good point, because I'm still very much, the one thing about journalism that has always been true for the good ones, and I aspire to that, is that you must try and triangulate the truth as much as you can, because sometimes you're not going to know what the right answer is. I don't have lived experience with everything I write about, quite obviously, but I cover the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and I don't have a disability that I'm aware of. I might have a mental health condition, but I don't consider myself to be disabled. I'm not in a residential aged care nursing home. And I've been on youth allowance, but I've never been on New Start or what they now call Job Seeker. So I don't necessarily know, but I do have a very good idea of what it feels like to be on the outside and to not be believed. And particularly when you come from, the lower echelons, quote unquote, of society, there is a tendency among not just people, but the institutions that are built to govern us, to not believe testimony of the masses. Only people who have accumulated knowledge, who are admitted into these institutions, can govern and can judge. And so one of the most powerful acts as a journalist, I think, is to tell people, when they give you an honest assessment of their own life and their own circumstances, is to believe them. Particularly for disabled people, I didn't understand the extent of trauma in the disability community when I first started writing about it, but I didn't say to them or to myself that I didn't believe them. I just had to work really hard at understanding why that was. And it started with that kernel of belief, just saying, I accept this. It's kind of like improv. You say yes and. So I was saying yes and with people who came up to me in my life. And someone on Twitter actually summed up my journalism best a couple of months ago now, but they were saying, because I was getting called biased for something or other. People were mad at me. I was about an article I wrote about Tim Wilson and superannuation, because I was just letting him draw himself out on his policy. And someone was like, I find that Rick Morton's not biased against any particular political party. He's just biased against idiocy and stupidity. And I'm like, you know what? I think that's a motto I can get on board with. I work really hard at finding out what is true and based on facts and evidence. And if you're clearly running up against that, or you're running a bad faith argument, then I'm sorry, I'm not going to be particularly nice about it.
Yeah. I think particularly in the role of journalism, it's really interesting how I think we ask writers to tell us what happened sometimes. Like we can't process the things that go on around us in work, but we wait for writers to reflect it back to us. So if a journalist is not reflecting back to us anything particularly about what just happened with, COVID-19, for example, there's going to be a lot more of that as we kind of process what the deep impact of that across the globe. It's probably not the greatest example, but
it's true. It's the same reason I read poetry about love. I needed to know that I wasn't alone in my reflections, but I also needed to know what they looked like when they're in the world, because internally we think with our subconscious most of the time, as in in the background it just thinks in pictures and frames and not full sentences. So I think it's quite valuable, but it can be it's a hard thing to do well, I think. And I'm not saying I get it right even now all that often, but it's something that I try really hard to do. Like, I don't like writing something, and my editors will attest to this. If they ask me to do something, a story, And, you know, if I think I can do it, I'll be like, yeah, absolutely. But if I'm like, you know what, I don't think I'm going to get the information on this, and I don't want to write something that I don't know that I can deliver.
Yeah. I want to ask you about writing about animals.
Yeah, good. This is my favorite chapter. Well, one of my favorite chapters.
I thought, why did you decide to include animals? What did you want to say about love and vulnerability in your chapter about animals?
Do you know what? It started with an instinct. I didn't know, and this may be obvious in the reading because it was a kind of chapter that kind of stood out as being like, why is it here? But like instinctively, I knew that animals was such a common thread in my life from the moment I was born, still to this day, particularly through the prism of my own mother's kind of love for her chickens and her dog and her cat. The cat was threatening to jump in here before. It's currently on her bed, I think. But I knew that there was something. I mean, we think of ourselves as a species as apart from the rest of the animals, and we're not. We are very much of them, and we have got to this position in our own kind of meteoric rise as Homo sapiens on the backs of them, sometimes quite literally. But also they've fed us, they've clothed us, they've, you know, kept us company. They've, you know, spread diseases on our behalf. Thank you, COVID-19, and possibly a pangolin or a horseshoe bat, who knows? But they're also just fucking fascinating. Like they're just, I mean, to imagine the world through the eyes of an animal is such a fun little adventure. And particularly when you get to the cuttlefish, which is something I've always wanted to write about. Damn you, Julia Baird, for getting there first. But like you know, I grew up with cattle, which you might not necessarily think of as having an inner world. But I've looked directly into their eyes, and I can guarantee you that they do. And our kind of communion with them, I guess, was not through a radical greens environmental lens, but there was an innate understanding that they were beautiful in their own right. And I think having had such close access to it as a kid, there is something about my life now that is open and generous to the extent that it is because they were there. Like I think they were the first chink in my armor, I guess, against the world, because I loved them. And you actually find, not that I have any experience with this personally, but you find this with, you know, kids with autism or adults with autism who connect through horses or through dogs or therapy animals. There is something quite amazing about the way that they facilitate our being here. And so I knew I had to have that in the book. I just didn't know how I was going to say it. And I'm still thinking of its impact. I just know it's true.
Yeah. Well, let's regard the cow as your therapy animal then, because I want to ask you about Mr. Yoshizawa, the cow terrorist.
Yes.
Can you please tell us that story?
I love him. So this happened by accident, really. But I was, because I knew I was writing a chapter on animals, but then I was talking to a sex worker, as it happens, in Sydney about Japan and loneliness, because she knew I was going to Tokyo. And then she just mentioned, she's like, you can get on a bus and you can go to the Fukushima exclusion zone in Japan, where, the nuclear power plant melted down after that tsunami, which we just celebrated 10 years of. God, I'm so sorry, but commemorated 10 years of. And I remember watching that tsunami roll in, in 2011, just not long after my birthday or before it. And so it had been something that had been stuck in my mind anyway. And I didn't know about Yoshizawa at this point. But she mentioned that there is this farmer that stayed behind and refused government orders to kill his own cattle. He had 260 of them, 14 kilometers from the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, which is the one that exploded and spewed cesium isotopes and other forms of radiation into the landscape for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers. So he was in the exclusion zone. And all the other farmers and graziers either fled and left their cattle to die of natural causes, and some of them quite horrifically, or they came back and shot them humanely on government orders. But Yoshizawa refused. And not only did he refuse to kill them, but he stayed behind. And so this was a man who previously farmed cattle for slaughter. And my father was someone who was a cattle grazier, and we cared about our cattle to the extent that we wanted to keep them stress-free because they were better eating. But I wouldn't say that the love extended beyond that. And yet somehow in this great calamity, this massive atrocity where 16,000 people died, Yoshizawa has decided that not only does he not want to kill the cattle, but he wants to stay behind on radioactive land and look after them, even though he doesn't have a livelihood anymore. And to this day, he still has the original 260 cattle. And he said to me, he's like, they're my friends. Like, I don't feel lonely. And it's allowed him to become what he is now, which is an anti-nuclear activist. And all of these things are linked together, I think, because, you know, our quest for power and I mean quite literally in that sense, energy, has led us to make grave mistakes, I think, as a species. And there is something very simple about his kind of conversion on the road to Damascus, which just involved his 260 cattle.
You just couldn't believe what you'd come across when you came across that story.
I mean, no. I mean, like, and literally, like, he's like that guy that you see in the beginning of disaster movies. He's running around trying to warn everyone. He's like, you know, this is gonna blow. It's like Dante's Peak. It's a volcano. It's terrible. Or it's like this nuclear power plant is a risk to humanity. And he's got that kind of vibe. Like, he's a little bit mad and eccentric, but in the best possible way. But you know, in my experience, people who love their animals are a little bit mad and eccentric, but it's almost like they've figured out the secret to existence, which is to be open to these things. And yeah, I just, you know, having come from the childhood I did on this kind of 1,000 square kilometer cattle station, where, you know, me and my brother made the mistake of making friends with one bullock once, literally as it was getting loaded onto the truck to get taken to the Roma meatworks. And that was the first and last time I made, you know, best friends with a cow, because he was gone and he met his end. And so there was a kind of stuntedness, I guess, about our willingness to express that love in future. But Yoshizawa overcame it and he became an advocate for his cows, which I just think is very cool.
That kind of his tenderness with his animals leads me onto your chapter about masculinity, and it's an interesting time to be talking about that. In fact, there's a few of your chapters that have turned out to be even more pertinent over the last 12 months, probably as you were writing the book. But I'm particularly interested in your assessment of the climate for gay men at the moment.
That's a very good point, because I noticed that in the kind of chaos and mess of what's been happening in Parliament House, all of a sudden we've got, you know, Peter Credlin and other commentators talking about the fact that there were gay sex orgies in Parliament House. And look, I mean, one of the staffers who did that, one of the staffers who did that horrible act on the female MP's desk was a gay staffer. And I am the last person who is going to defend gay men against allegations of misogyny, because it is rife within certain sections of our community, particularly among white gay men. Like, there are kind of hierarchies of privilege within our own community. And so we're not immune from that. And there is a certain kind of gay man that thinks that they are, including the one that you probably all knew from the club, who was very touchy and you know, thought that he could touch his female friend wherever he wanted because he was gay, and that was okay. And it's not. But very quickly, the kind of conversation in Parliament House has kind of turned to this, but there are gay people there, which I find very gross. And it's not coming from a good faith argument of, well, we need to deal with misogyny and sexism, which is possible not only in gay men, but in women, including some women in the coalition who are, you know, avatars of the patriarchy. Some of them willing, some of them not, but it's just so ingrained in our culture. I'm an avatar of the patriarchy, and I try and fight against it with, you know, these observations, but also actions. But, you know, we've come a long way, and like, to a certain extent, the story is not really about gay men anymore. It's about trans men and women who, you know, where the real fight and the real oppression is. But all forms of oppression are a species of hurt. And I think, you know, while there is always a kind of scale of such things, where you allow it anywhere, you allow it everywhere, I think is one of those kind of famous sayings about it. So, you know, there's much that we can learn, I guess, from the ways, and I try to do this in my writing, in my reporting, as someone who grew up gay in country Queensland, but also poor. I have some understanding of what it is like to be a minority. Not all the understanding, but that should be the engine room that powers your curiosity about other forms of suffering. And, obviously I'm not a woman, but that is also something that powers my thinking about the way women are treated. And it's not an excuse to be a gay man and treat women badly. It's not good enough. But the bigger conversation is about, the ways in which masculinity has been weaponized against women. And it has always been so, but you would think in a more enlightened time such as this, that the progress would be faster. And it's not. And it's quite disappointing to see that we still have a prime minister who just does not get it, like clearly does not get it.
Well, Deb had an outburst about Andrew Laming tonight, didn't she?
She did, and it was totally unexpected. She's my little barometer for all things real Australia, quote unquote, because I couldn't tell you how she votes. I genuinely couldn't. But she just looked at Channel 9 News and it was a story about Andrew Laming. She's like, oh, they should get rid of him. She's like, what the fuck is that saying to other women that he's there? And as someone on Twitter pointed out, what's that saying to other men? He's allowed to stay at the moment with impunity for another year, $200,000 a year. It's just gross.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen my Twitter feed so completely densely packed with the same topic as I have over the last few weeks. So yeah, there's definitely an extreme pushback.
And I want to be very clear that this is not a comment about Andrew Laming in particular, but the qualities that he has shown in parts of his life are qualities that ought to raise alarm bells wherever they are found. They are not, trolling, harassment, kind of abusive threats to people, upskirting photos. Like these are things that you would associate with a kind of sick mind. And it's worrying that not even this is enough to force the Prime Minister. I mean, the Prime Minister is perfectly correct in saying that this is a matter for the Queensland LNP party, but there is nothing stopping the Prime Minister from, I know this is a radical concept, showing some leadership and saying he ought to be gone. Like, it's not hard to say those words. He's said some stranger words in his time. So, like, give it a go. You have a go, you got to go.
Just excuse me one sec, Rick. Jane, the computer's telling me that I've got low battery. Just wanted to let you know before things go disastrously wrong. I'm really interested, Rick, in the fact that I know that your writing appeals strongly to women. And so I'm interested in the kind of responses that you get from men, because to be touched by your work as a man, I think it would be quite a beautiful experience. But whether, how much you're hearing back from the men who are experiencing your work is quite interesting to me.
Heaps. And it's so, every single one of them surprises me. Because, from the first book on, from 100 Years of Dirt to this very day, I get messages from people, particularly, regional Queensland farming, or like far out Pilbara kind of WA men, like hard, tough, stereotypical men, who write to me and kind of share their innermost thoughts about how they wish they could have been more vulnerable, or wish they could have told their family they loved them more, or who have lost, good relationships with their own children because they couldn't be there for them. And I suspect my own father is exactly that person. I've never thought he was a bad person. And so there was always a kind of a suspicion that there was a whole kind of mass of men out there who want to be all these things, which is what I find so kind of sorrowful about the whole affair, is that this is, we have kind of locked ourselves in a prison and then become upset at the consequences, at the lack of freedom. And we've got the key, but we actually would rather watch kind of, these beautiful elements of our life fade and wilt away, rather than unlock the lock. And when I get these messages from men, part of me is astonished that they even send them, because I imagine that must be a really hard thing to do. And it is, because I've been there myself in my 20s, to admit that kind of vulnerability. And even me saying admit makes it sound like it's a crime. It's not. But that's how we think. I'm still fighting this every day. But then the other part of me is like, well, I was doing an event on the weekend, and there was this lovely bloke in the audience who kept saying, yeah, but there's like, there's 5 kinds of men that we have to be. You got to be the soldier, or you got to be the I don't know, there was 4 others that I can't quite remember off the top of my head. And I was just like, I just put him up. I'm like, but no one, like, yes, you think you have to be that because you think society wants you to be that. But the only person at the end of the day that enforces that is you. Like, it's the only person. Because, and something else, which was a remarkable realization later on in my life, is that we do all of these things because for the most part, we think people are paying attention to us, and they're not. like people are not thinking about us in the way that we think about us, about ourselves. It's just not the case. So look, I find it particularly beautiful and also melancholy when I get these messages from men, because it's my own experience. It's the experience of my father, I think, and kind of so many other men in my life growing up, and it just saddens me so deeply that it's still the case.
Rick, here's a question I should have asked you way earlier in the interview. Why did you call the book My Year of Living Vulnerably?
Good question. I mean, all of my book titles so far seem to have started out as a joke, which says something about me as a person, I think. This was first used, I think, in 2017, this form of words, when I was having a Facebook chat with a really dear friend of mine called Mitchell Bingaman. He'd just given me one of his favorite books, The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut, to read. And I had just finished it and I just fell in love with it. Like, it was such a beautiful book. And I remember finding the words in the book so moving that I messaged him and I quoted him my favorite 19 lines. Oh, hello, Jane.
Hi, we're just switching because, like, it's
Oh, did you lose the?
So yeah, my laptop died, but that Meri was using, so we're just using the other one now.
Happy days.
Happy days.
Oh, so sorry, we didn't hear what you said about from when you were talking about the joke.
Oh yes,
title.
Of course. So I mean, it started out as a joke, or kind of like just something that came into my head at the moment. I was having a kind of tough time in 2017, which was something that happened quite a lot. And one of my close friends, Mitchell Bingaman, lent me his copy of The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut, which I'd never read before. And it was one of his favorite books. And I fell in love with it immediately. And the language was so beautiful. And I started chatting to him on Facebook Messenger, and I quoted him my favorite 19 lines, which I'd underlined. And I remember telling him in that chat, I'm like, I have already, in a way, I guess, started what I am now calling my year of living vulnerably, which is this kind of opening up to the world. And at that point, it was more of a kind of vague concept in my head because I'd been doing little tiny bits and pieces of it. But that's the first time I used that title, and I'd never really thought of it again until I did this book. And I realized that it had been there all along, like this effort, I guess, and this program of writing myself had already begun. And so the year is not necessarily a chronological year, but it's oh God, the word journey is so terrible, but it is a trip, I guess.
One.
What's that, sorry? Yes, one. I get one journey. One journey.
I said you can use the word journey once. Yeah, only one journey. Yeah. I actually, speaking about Kurt Vonnegut, reminds me that I wanted to ask you, there are so many literary references in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really quite extensive. Your reading is obviously it's all the way from the ancients all the way through to really modern work. And I'm interested to know who has led you to what in terms of your reading, because it's obvious a personal pleasure of yours now.
Honestly, I'm astonished you say that, because I have such a chip on my shoulder about having not read the classics or the right books, because I didn't grow up with them, and it took me a long time to understand that they were there and accessible to me. But I have always, in fact, I gave a talk over the weekend to a year 10 extension English class, and they were studying To Kill a Mockingbird, and I haven't read it. So, are you still there? I can't even. Whoop. Hello, Meri. Hello, Meri. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Hear me?
Oh, I can now. Yes.
Oh, he can't hear me.
Oh, I can now. I just wasn't sure if you could hear me.
Well.
I'm sorry. Oh, and now you're repeating for some reason. That's better. I'm going to keep it like that. Shall I just keep going? Where did you hear up to? No.
I think you were thinking about how you hadn't read and so it was a that sense of inadequacy, and I do relate to that, because even doing this kind of work, interviewing authors, I feel like I could never have read enough to sit down and talk to an author. So I completely relate to what you're saying. But you're referencing in the book, which is always there to support the argument that you're making about any one particular thing, tells me that you've read interestingly and widely. Even if it's not what you...
I read, I read in the same way that my music taste develops, which is eclectically.
Perfect reading.
And I don't have a system for it. Like I come across stuff either online or through friends who recommend stuff to me, but also I seek out, particularly on subjects like physics and science and philosophy, I'm constantly seeking out stuff in those realms because it's just the way my mind is built. I'm not saying I'm good at, absorbing any of these things, but I seek them out. And then, I get lucky with these books like Ocean Vuong's, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which is one of the best books I've ever read. And he's one of my favorite writers of all time, because his facility with language is so precise and breathtakingly good. And when I read, I underline sentences and passages. And in many respects, I do that because they accord to my way of thinking already. And so I'm collecting them for use specifically in writing, because I want to kind of deify these wonderful sentences and hope to do them some justice. And so I kind of approach my writing by wanting to pay tribute to these grand kind of artifices and structures. And I guess that's kind of how they make their way in. But I've always had a very eclectic reading sense. Like I will happily read science fiction, but also read, ancient Greek philosophers and Ocean Vuong and poetry from Jane Hirschfield and Wisław Szymborska, who's my favorite poet of all time. And, whatever, writing is writing, whatever sings. It's a very finicky
Rick,
connection.
we've got the most terrible, unstable internet connection now. Are you experiencing that at your end as well?
I am at my end, yes, but I can hear you again now.
I feel like the right thing to do is to let you go. But I also feel like there's probably a dozen questions in the room as well. So does anyone have a burning question that they really must pitch to Rick before we end this conversation? No, it doesn't seem so, in fact, but there's a couple of online questions. Do you mind, Rick, if you can still hear me? Yep. Bree's asking, I'd like to know how Rick defines love now.
I love that question. So to me, love is kind of like it's the way, I write about it at the end of the book, but it's about turning to face the world. So love is not about hiding yourself away. And it's not purely about happy things. It's about bearing the sad stuff and the hurtful stuff, because the exposure to the other stuff is better than that. And in fact, it only works when you can put it in context. A beautiful scene is only beautiful because we have suffered, I think. And if we only ever had, pure love all the time, it would not work. And it would not be something that we aspire to. And so I think love, not just romantically, but love is really a way of existing in the world that opens us and turns us to face the extent of everything. And that's how I define it. And James Baldwin's got a better definition than me, which is, he talks about this sense of personal quest and daring and growth. And that's the definition I most align myself with.
I'm going to let you have the last word on that, because that sounds like a perfect way to summarize the conversation. It's certainly well achieved with my year of living vulnerably. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Rick. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meri. You're such a beautiful interviewer and a beautiful person, and I'm stoked that you said yes to doing this.
Thank you so much. Speak soon. I'll message you.
I'll leave. Bye-bye.